40 children were left fatherless in that one shoot down, including our 2 grandchildren, Reagan, who was 23 months old, and Chamberlain, who was 9 weeks old. 40 children lost their father in a 1960s era helicopter that was last retrofitted in 1985, before most of them were born. We found out that night that they were flown into a 3.5-hour firefight with no pre-assault fire. We asked why. The answer was because pre-assault fire is damaging to our efforts to win the hearts and minds of the Afghanis. After the helicopter was shot down and 30 Americans were laying on the ground burning, our air weapons team, above the most powerful the world has ever known, an AC-130 Spectre gunship and 2 AH-64 Apache helicopters, were unable to return fire on the men who shot down the chopper, again, because of rules of engagement, because they couldn't be certain there weren't friendlies inside the building underneath the tower the men stood on when they launched the RPGs. That is just a drop in the bucket, unfortunately, to what we've learned since Aaron died. We're not going to let another young man or woman die while we sit silently in our house, pretending that what's going on is not going on, that their hands are not being tied behind their backs, that they're not being completely limited and being caused to fight with rules against an enemy who is as savage as any this nation has ever fought. We've heard stories that would absolutely make you just think we couldn't possibly be telling the truth. Stories of men who chased men who planted IEDs, begging their commanders to let them take them out because they'd seen them do it so many times, and be refused the opportunity to take them out, and then finally end up dying at the hands of those very men. I've talked to too many mothers like that whose children shed their blood against an enemy they should have been able to capture or kill many times over. I've talked to a mother whose son was killed by an Afghani ally that manned a tower on a U.S. base and opened fire on the men below. Shot him in the throat. That's exactly right. And he bled out because nobody could get to him to help him. He actually strangled on his own blood because no one could get to him because of the fire coming from the tower on our base. We've got another friend right now. This circle of friends we've made, it's tragic, folks. It's tragic, and I'll tie it all together of why I believe it's so tragic, so much more than just example by example. We've got another friend right now whose son was killed while he was lifting weights on his base. You might have heard about it. And instead of responding to yet another green on blue attack by the T-boy, which is, we all know what that represents, right? In Afghani language, the sexual plaything of a police chief in Afghanistan who was allowed to come on our base, even though he'd been thrown off of our bases before because he was involved in drugs, he was involved in child prostitution, but we allowed him on our base. Why? Appeasement. So instead of sounding all the alarms about this man whose T-boy took his guns and killed 3 Americans while they worked out and severely injured another, our government went after the man who tried to warn them that the police chief was on their base and they needed to get rid of him. And I just want to know, what have we become? What are we doing? And I've never been an anti-war person. I'm not today. I know that war is necessary. I know that every time Aaron left, I knew he might not come home. That was an understanding we had. We believed he would, of course, because you have to as a parent, or you can't get through it. But we knew. People say, oh, they're just grieving parents. They dismiss us so easily. And there is almost nothing. They're looking for closure. No, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking to stop this madness. We're hoping that our voice can penetrate through all the BS that's out there and cut through to the heart of what's going on in our country, in our military, and across these lands. We raised Aaron in the 80s, and I want to tell you this. We raised Aaron in the 80s when America was strong. We taught him to love this country the way we loved this country, the way our parents loved this country. He was 6 years old when Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." That's who we were. That's the nation we raised our boy in. That's the nation our son loved enough to die for. Not this. What made Aaron so unusual in our eyes? People ask us all the time. There's a lot of things he did that were incredible. But what made him so unusual? And Billy and I always go straight back to the fact that Aaron gave his life to Christ at a very young age. And because of that, he had a discernment about him that was really uncharacteristic of a young boy. He could always differentiate right from wrong. He could always cut straight through to the truth. And many times he embarrassed his father and I beyond belief in those situations. You know, we'd be sitting there with family and he'd just point his finger and say, "You're all right." And we'd be like, "Oh, don't, you can't. You know, but that's just who he was. He was a noble human. You know, by the time he was 8 years old, he'd tell anybody who would listen that one day he was going to be a Navy SEAL. We all would just think that was funny because he was 6'4" by the time he was an adult. But you know how those tall kids are that are skinny as a bone. They're just as gangly and uncoordinated, and it was hilarious to hear him say it. But he knew in his heart what he'd been created to be. None of the rest of us could see it. But God could see it, and Aaron knew it. And so, you know, Aaron went through his life and he had two goals in his life. He wanted to play college football and he wanted to be a Navy SEAL. He ended up being a pretty good football player. By the time he got to his senior year in high school, just before his first game, in practice he obliterated the ACL in his left knee. They did surgery. He was devastated, but he was a rebounder, you know, fighter, had that spirit. And they reconstructed his knee. Everything was good. He started working out again. His coaches started sending tapes trying to still get him into some college somewhere, you know, even if it was a junior college or something. And he was excited about life. And just before school got out, his senior year, he was playing a pickup game of basketball in the afternoon and blew that knee out again. Ripped every ligament in it. He went back in thinking, "I'll just get it repaired again. Okay, it's another setback. We can do this." But this time the surgeon came out and said, "There was nothing I could do. There's not anything left to attach an ACL to." So Aaron had to surrender every dream he'd ever had. It was the most devastating thing I ever witnessed, honestly, because the boy was crushed. Absolutely crushed. He was 18 years old. He'd always known what he needed to do. He's always known who he was going to be, what he was going to do in life. And now all of a sudden, when it's time to go out into the great unknown, everything's changed. And he took a while. You know, he was sad. I'll tell you, he was sad. He was devastated for a while. But again, our boy was a rebounder. He went on to college, got a great job at a plush golf course in South Florida, Jupiter Island Club Golf Course, you know, had a wonderful career, was building a life there. And then came September 11th, 2001. And I remember as our family gathered at the house that night, you know, there was just something in Aaron's face that was different than the rest of us. All of us were sick and outraged, but there was something different in his face. There was a righteous anger and an indignation that he was going to do something about it. And sir, God loves you. This nation grieves with you still. But you know, we were watching all those images of the towers falling and the smoke that was rolling through and the devastation in New York City. But the one thing that got to our boy so much and really impacted his life were the 40 citizens on Flight 93 who stood up and took their rightful place in history and prevented what possibly could have been the most nationally devastating attack of all of them that took place that morning. And he heard that Todd Beamer story of Let's Roll, and man, his heart just started churning. He came home on his 21st birthday not many months later, and he sat down at the table after work and he said, "Mom and Dad, I stopped at the Navy office today and I joined the SEAL Challenge program." He said, "Okay, how do you think you're going to do that?" Because he couldn't even He couldn't even play basketball without a brace on. You know, those special ACL braces that create a new ligament, you know, that's not there. And he said, you know, basically to sum it all up, he said, if God wants me to do this, he'll enable me to do it with or without an ACL in my knee. And I'm going to make a long story short. 157 men started Bud's Class 248. 7 finished. And Aaron was one of them. And he wasn't, and nobody ever knew he didn't have the ACL because, you know, Billy said, well, son, did you tell the recruiter that you don't have an ACL? He's like, no. If I did, they wouldn't have let me try. So I go, okay. He not only made it through in that phenomenal way, his name is still memorialized in Coronado on a plaque that says first time, every time. He's one of the rare people in history who every single evolution that was required of him, he completed the first time he tried it. Because God had a plan for Aaron's life. Aaron, you know, on August 6th, he was at the pinnacle of his life, at the pinnacle of his career. He had a beautiful wife at home. They just had their second child, like I said earlier, Reagan and Chamberlain. And, you know, everything was good. But then, you know, when Billy and I got that call on August 6th, we honestly could not believe what we were hearing. You know, it's one of those times in your life where you just can't believe that it happened to you. But I don't want to stand here and feel sorry for myself. What I want to tell you tonight is, please don't let my son's life be lost in vain. This nation needs attention like it's never needed it before. It needs patriots to rise up like they've never risen up before. It needs people, just common, ordinary people. You know, Jeff and I were talking just before we got started tonight. The difference that one person can make is astronomical if you put your heart to it. You can make a difference. It's not a hopeless cause, and it's still a very much worthy cause. And now with all this crap that's going on with this ridiculously apathetic, wretched excuse for a commander-in-chief. We need to act. We need to get that man out of office. We don't only need to get him out of office. He needs to be brought up on treasonous charges. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Billy because he's a lot smarter than me, and he's got a lot more he can add. But anyway, thank you so much for allowing us to be here, and thank you for your support.